A form of secular fundamentalism has recently developed in the Western world that, in style and strategy, is similar to the atheism of Vogt, Buchner, and Haeckel. While physicists have felt comfortable with the unknowing that seems to be an essential component of intellectual advance, some biologists, whose discipline has not yet experienced a major reversal, have remained confident of their capacity to discover absolute truth, and some, abandoning the agnostic restraint of Darwin and Huxley, have started to preach a militant form of atheism. In 1972, the French biochemist Jacques Monod, Nobel Prize winner and professor of molecular biology at the Collège de France, published Chance and Necessity, which argued for the absolute incompatibility of theism and evolutionary theory. Change is the result of chance and is propagated by necessity. It is, therefore, impossible to speak of purpose or design in the universe. We must accept the fact that we humans have come into being by accident, that there is no benign creator, no divine friend that shapes our lives and values, and that we are alone in the immense and impersonal cosmos. Like Clifford, Monod maintained that it was not only intellectually, but also morally wrong to accept any ideas that were not scientifically verifiable. But he admitted that there was no way of proving that this ideal of objectivity was in fact true. It was an ideal that was essentially arbitrary, a claim for which there was insufficient evidence. He thus tacitly admitted that even the scientific quest began with an act of faith. Monod's ideas were not always accessible to those not steeped in French culture, and some of the first popular expositions of the implications of evolution in the English-speaking world were written with great brilliance and clarity by the Oxford biologist Richard Dawkins. In The Blind Watchmaker, published in 1986, he explained that while Paley's argument for an intelligent designer had been perfectly acceptable in the early 19th century, Darwin had shown that the appearance of design occurred quite naturally in the process of evolutionary development. The blind watchmaker was natural selection, a blind, purposeless process that could not plan intelligently, nor could it deliberately produce the contrivance that Paley had found in nature. For Dawkins, atheism is a necessary consequence of evolution. He has argued that the religious impulse is simply an evolutionary mistake, a misfiring of something useful. It is a kind of virus, parasitic on cognitive systems naturally selected because they had enabled a species to survive. Dawkins is an extreme exponent of the scientific naturalism originally formulated by D'Holbach that has now become a major worldview among intellectuals. More moderate versions of this scientism have been articulated by Carl Sagan, Steven Weinberg, and Daniel Dennett, who have all claimed that one has to choose between science and faith. For Dennett, theology has been rendered superfluous because biology can provide a better explanation of why people are religious. But for Dawkins, like the other new atheists, Sam Harris, the young American philosopher and student of neuroscience, and Christopher Hitchens, critic and journalist, religion is the cause of all the problems of our world. It is the source of absolute evil and poisons everything. They see themselves in the vanguard of a scientific rational movement that will eventually expunge the idea of God from human consciousness. But other atheists and scientists are wary of this approach. The American zoologist, Stephen Jay Gould, followed Monod in his discussion of the implications of evolution. Everything in the natural world could indeed be explained by natural selection, but Gould insisted that science was not competent to decide whether God did or did not exist, because it could work only with natural explanations. Gould had no religious axe to grind. He described himself as an atheistically inclined agnostic, but pointed out that Darwin himself had denied that he was an atheist, and that other eminent Darwinians, Asa Gray, Charles D. Walcott, G. Simpson, and Theodosius Dobzhansky, had either been practicing Christians or agnostics. Atheism did not, therefore, seem to be a necessary consequence of accepting evolutionary theory, and Darwinians who held forth dogmatically on the subject were stepping beyond the limitations that were proper to science. Gould also revived, in new form, the ancient distinction and complementarity of mythos and logos in what he called NOMA, non-overlapping magisteria. A magisterium, he explained, was a domain where one form of teaching holds the appropriate tools for meaningful discourse and resolution. Religion and science were separate magisteria and should not encroach on each other's domain. The magisterium of science, he said, covers the empirical realm. What is the universe made of? Fact. And why does it work this way? Theory. The magisterium of religion extends over questions of ultimate meaning and moral value. These two magisteria do not overlap, nor do they encompass all inquiry. The idea of an inherent conflict between religion and science was false. They were, he said, two distinct magisteria that hold equal worth and necessary status for any complete human life, and remain logically distinct and fully separate in lines of inquiry. But the new atheists will have none of this, and in his somewhat immoderate way, Dawkins denounces Gould as a quisling. They adhere to a hard-line form of scientific naturalism that mirrors the fundamentalism on which they base their critique. Atheism is always a rejection of and parasitically dependent on a particular form of theism. The work of the new atheists has been exhaustively criticized, notably by John F. Hort, Alistair McGrath, and John Cornwell. Like Christian fundamentalists, they read Scripture in an entirely literal manner and seem never to have heard of the long tradition of allegoric or Talmudic interpretation, or indeed of the higher criticism. Harris seems to imagine that biblical inspiration means that the Bible was actually written by God. Hitchens assumes that faith is entirely dependent upon a literal reading of the Bible, and that, for example, the discrepancies in the gospel infancy narratives prove the falsity of Christianity. Either the Gospels are in some sense literal truth, he argues, or the whole thing is essentially a fraud, and perhaps a moral one at that. Like Protestant fundamentalists, Dawkins has a simplistic view of the moral teaching of the Bible, taking it for granted that its chief purpose is to issue clear rules of conduct and provide us with role models, which, not surprisingly, he finds lamentably inadequate. He also presumes that since the Bible claims to be inspired by God, it must also provide scientific information. Dawkins' only point of disagreement with the Protestant fundamentalists is that he finds the Bible unreliable about science, while they do not. It is not surprising that Dawkins is incensed with American creationists who are campaigning against the teaching of evolution, and the proponents of a new, quasi-scientific philosophy that has tried to revive the theory of intelligent design, or ID. These include Philip E. Johnson, professor of law at Berkeley and author of Darwin on Trial, the biochemist Michael Bay, author of Darwin's Black Box, and the philosopher William Dembski, author of The Design Inference.